The truth beneath perfection. My name is Emily Parker. At 36, I lived in the quiet promise of suburban Charlotte, North Carolina. A picturesque neighborhood, 2 laughing kids, 1 golden retriever, and a husband the neighbors admired. Tyler Parker, my husband, was everything on paper. A 41-year-old entrepreneur whose real estate firm seemed to grow as effortlessly as his bright white smile. Our family portraits hung on every wall, perfectly staged for holiday cards and social media admiration. Proof to everyone that we were the American dream incarnate. But beneath the polished surface, our home felt more like a stage than a sanctuary. Tyler was always 3 steps ahead, decisive and charismatic. But behind closed doors, his gaze often slid past me as if I were invisible. The world saw us as the power couple, yet I was simply an accessory, expected to manage the house, the kids, and the flawless party smiles, while big decisions were made without me. Conversations about our future became one-sided monologues. My opinions dissolved in his certainty, my desires brushed aside for his ambitions. Every time I peered into his eyes, I saw a man who mastered the art of performance, not partnership. For years, I played my part, telling myself I was lucky, that my doubts and unease were products of my own imagination. Late nights waiting for Tyler became routine. When he finally came home, his explanations dripped with charm, but left a bitter aftertaste of rehearsed lies. The distance grew until the only connection we shared was the rhythm of daily rolls. I found lipstick stains, not my own, whispers in the dark that tightened my chest at midnight. The truth was there, but it hid in the careful pleats of our life, buttoned up for all the world to envy. One morning, sunlight spilled across the marble kitchen countertop as I poured Tyler's coffee. He barely glanced up from his phone, already engrossed in contracts and meetings. In that moment of mundane routine, a quiet realization struck me. I had become a ghost in my own story. This flawless life was nothing more than a perfectly painted set. And I wondered, for the first time, not with anger or despair, but with ice-steady clarity, what it would take to peel back the layers of perfection and reveal the truth. Because if I did not, I would spend the rest of my life being everyone's idea of perfect, except my own. The price of trust isn't built overnight, and Madison knew this all too well. In the earliest days of their marriage, life with Andrew felt like a sun-splashed photograph. Light pouring in from every direction, endless possibilities captured in candid smiles. Their promises were whispered in the backs of coffee shops, sealed with gentle fingers intertwined across dinner tables, and woven into every late-night word. Madison believed every one of those promises. Why wouldn't she? Andrew had mastered the art of sincerity. Even when he spoke about his wildest dreams, his eyes didn't waver. For years, that unwavering gaze steadied her whenever the rest of the world felt uncertain. But trust, Madison would learn, was also fragile, delicate as porcelain and just as easily cracked. The first fissures were so subtle, she almost didn't see them. Business calls Andrew refused to take within earshot. Odd gaps in his schedule, explanations that unraveled the more she questioned them. He was working late, always working late, yet his company never seemed to need him at the same hours twice. "It's just the nature of the real estate business," he said, kissing her forehead distractedly, eyes already roaming beyond her, as if searching for escape. Then there were the birthday parties missed, the anniversaries forgotten. Madison tried, at first, to be understanding, telling herself she'd known from the start that Andrew's ambition was a living, moving thing. She told herself he was sacrificing for them both, building a future that would eventually let them rest. What she didn't say aloud, and maybe not even to herself, was the silence that sometimes filled their home after another missed dinner, or the way the children stopped asking when Daddy would be home. Nights grew longer. Andrew never seemed to sleep beside her for more than a few hours before he was up, out, chasing deals, or sending emails deep into the morning. A different kind of doubt began to take root, a twisting thing that bloomed in the dark. Madison became an expert at reading into micro-expressions, the offhand comments that didn't quite match up, the hurried goodbyes. She started noticing things: perfume on his shirt sleeves that didn't belong to her, receipts for dinners at places she'd never been. Still, she clung to the version of Andrew she'd fallen in love with, not ready to confront the reality that her trust was being tested in ways she never imagined. It wasn't just the potential betrayal that wounded Madison. It was the realization that her own sense of reality was slipping. Trust, once the scaffolding of her world, had slowly transformed into a stage prop, a thing she carried because she always had, not because it was still sturdy enough to bear the weight of her life. Betrayal, she realized, wasn't always a sudden shattering. Sometimes it was a steady erosion, an unraveling of small moments until even the smallest gesture, a late-night text Andrew refused to show her, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, felt suspect. The day Madison allowed herself to truly acknowledge her suspicion, she stood before the bathroom mirror and asked the reflection, "When did you stop trusting him?" The answer was not a date, not a single moment, but 1,000 tiny ones, each more silent than the last. Trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and sometimes a lifetime to repair. For Madison, every broken piece was a reminder that the price of trust is highest when you have risked everything, and now stood, trembling, at the edge of what you once believed. Planning revenge anguish has a peculiar gift: clarity. No longer lulled by habit or hope, I began to see the mechanisms of Ethan's empire with new eyes. If the past years had taught me anything, it was how to listen in the silences, how to learn from subtle shifts in tone, routine, and relationships. For the first time in years, I felt a pulse of resolve. If I had been kept at arm's length from Ethan's world, I would now become its unseen observer, and eventually, its orchestrator. Revenge, I decided, would be neither explosive nor public. I didn't want to throw plates, scream in hallways, or fight for pity. My goal was to strip away the layers of illusion and expose the truth, not just to Ethan, but to every person who had mistaken his charm for character. It began, as all worthwhile plots do, with research. I started shadowing Ethan's digital shadow, following company updates, reviewing board meeting minutes made public, and quietly reaching out to old acquaintances who had, for one reason or another, drifted from the Grant inner circle. At the country club, I took up tennis lessons, an activity I loathed. Knowing that Ethan's business partner, Charles, played every Friday morning, I enlisted old college friends who worked in corporate law and asked innocuous questions over lunch, pretending to be idly curious about legal structures, company filings, whistleblower policies. Late at night, I combed through public records. I tracked Ethan's shell companies, property investments, and grants awarded to consultants, confident now that many were more than they seemed. I built a map of his connections, a web of influence that once seemed opaque, and now revealed even more vulnerabilities than expected. It astonished me how easily cracks began to show once I got out of my own shadow. But careful as my investigation was, I knew the real battle would be waged Not with data, but with people. Ethan trusted three men above all: Charles, his business partner; Kevin, his longtime project manager; and Paul, a private banker who handled the wealth behind the scenes. My next move was to infiltrate this triangle without raising suspicion. I orchestrated casual run-ins and serendipitous conversations. An accidental meeting at the local coffee house with Charles, faking surprise at our coincidence. A school fundraiser chat with Kevin's wife. Ethan always says how crucial Kevin is. A chance to share a lift with Paul after a town council meeting. My approach was never to directly accuse anyone or extract information, but to plant subtle seeds of doubt and curiosity by sharing small, nearly insignificant pieces of questionable business practices. I gave each man something to ponder, never enough to suggest my involvement, but always enough to make them believe a larger truth was barely out of reach. Weeks passed. I could see it working. Ethan's meetings became more frequent and urgent. Late-night phone calls ended in terse silences, and the once rock-solid camaraderie began to strain. I sent anonymous tips, well-documented, factual, impossible to trace, to two local journalists known for their investigative grit. I shared nods and side comments with employees in the break room, nudging suspicions just enough for office whispers to begin. Throughout it all, I often wavered, torn between vengeance and the desire for simple honesty. But each time I hesitated, I thought about the lies that had built every day of my marriage, and the way my sons deserved a mother who chose truth over facades. Revenge, for me, was not destruction. It was a long, careful peeling away, layer by layer, of the masks Ethan wore. I became the ghost haunting his decisions, invisible but inescapable. The more Ethan tried to clamp down on leaks or monitor his circle, the more desperate he became. Publicly, his tone became clipped. Partners looked over their shoulders. Investors, once eager, demanded new rounds of due diligence. I did not need to force his hand, only to let the natural consequence of concealed truths and fractured alliances play out. I kept a step ahead, maintaining careful records, watching each move unfold. It was not victory I craved, but liberation. I wanted Ethan and the town to see who he really was when perfection was peeled away. It was in that steady unraveling that I found pieces of myself once lost to the role of the silent wife. Placing the final chess piece on the board, I realized that the real triumph was not in shattering his world, but in reclaiming my own. Drawing closer to his confidants, tactical patience had become my greatest ally. If Mark's life was a fortress built on tight-knit relationships and carefully cultivated alliances, then the path into the heart of that fortress was through his trusted inner circle. The world of tech entrepreneurship was as much about reputation as it was innovation. Mark's two closest confidants were Ethan Roy, his longtime project manager, and Linda Parker, his ever-loyal legal counsel. Both had been guests at our family dinners. Both had celebrated holidays with us, and both had, I suspected, helped shield Mark's secrets, even unconsciously. The approach required a delicate touch. One misstep, and I'd risk exposing my intentions. I began with Ethan, the kind of man who thrived on routine and camaraderie. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave at the office, and his loyalty to Mark was built on years of shared triumphs and early morning brainstorms. I started attending the company's morning coffee briefings, an uncommon occurrence for a spouse, but framed as newfound interest in my husband's growing empire. My presence was always casual, my questions light. How's the new client onboarding going? Or, Someone mentioned late nights for the product launch. Is the team holding up? Each interaction was an opportunity. Ethan was proud of his role. So when he began sharing details about internal turbulence, I simply listened. No follow-ups, no pressure. Over time, I dropped neutral comments about Mark's business trips, his shifts in priority, or inconsistencies in his statements. It didn't take much. A raised eyebrow here, a knowing glance there. For Ethan to wonder if things really were as stable as they seemed. Linda, on the other hand, was more guarded. She was sharp, intuitive, and fiercely private. But she also cared deeply about company ethics and legal boundaries. I asked her for lunch, framing it as a chance to talk about work-life balance. The classic ally-building move. During our meal, I slipped in my concerns as hypotheticals. If someone in your position ever saw a deal that didn't feel right on paper, what would you do? Linda's guard went up, but her eyes darted across my face, searching for subtleties. I let the conversation drift back to our daughter's school events and her passion for running marathons. But the seed was planted. It was a gradual weave, not just into their routines, but into their doubts. Every piece of gossip I heard about the office, every murmured suspicion about changes in budgets or unexplained cutbacks, I cataloged. At game nights, I observed the tense silences between Mark and Ethan when certain business topics surfaced. At company barbecues, I watched the way Linda's smile faltered when investors pressed about project timelines she knew weren't being met honestly. Behind closed doors, I ventured into the digital shadows with late-night research. I traced Mark's newly incorporated shell companies and cross-referenced them against clients who'd recently gone silent. I skimmed through offhand comments in Linda's legal reports. Patterns began to emerge: misplaced funds, falsified statements, and hastily signed contracts. When I found proof, I didn't confront. Instead, I gave Ethan and Linda just enough information in private conversations to nudge their instincts. I also quietly reconnected with past associates, people who'd left the company or distanced themselves from Mark's circle without public explanation. A few were willing to share anecdotes about deals that felt off, questionable expense reports, or Mark's tendency to pressure for silent compliance. Never a direct accusation, always an invitation to remember a moment, question a detail, or revisit a forgotten lunch. At home, I balanced this undercurrent of strategy with the appearance of normalcy.
We're gonna get through this.
I still packed school lunches, still coordinated play dates, but my real mission was slow and relentless: to sow doubt where there had only been loyalty, and to raise questions that couldn't be answered with charisma alone. It wasn't about turning Mark's allies into enemies, but rather helping them realize that perfection never protected anyone. The cracks weren't new, just ignored. The dominoes started to tremble. Ethan grew cautious in meetings, hesitated before blindly backing Mark's decisions. Linda became more insistent on reviewing financial documents. I observed, adjusted, documented everything. The more information I spun into their lives, the more Mark's castle of trust became a fragile house of cards, teetering on the edge of revelation. I had become the unseen presence at every strategy session, the quiet voice behind every innocent question. Strategic empathy was my tool. Patience was my shield. In drawing closer to his confidants, I wasn't just inching toward exposing Mark. I was reclaiming my own agency, one small, deliberate step at a time. Unveiling the secrets, the house felt more like a chessboard now. Every piece, every move inched Susan closer to her endgame. She'd spent months living in the shadows, listening, watching, uncovering patterns behind Thomas's carefully manufactured facade. But information was only power if wielded precisely, and Susan had no intention of bursting onto the scene with reckless accusations or melodrama. Her goal was control, not chaos. The slow reveal would be so thorough, so exact, that by the time anyone realized what was happening, the cracks in Thomas's world would already be threatening to break everything apart. She started, as always, with caution. The things she'd discovered weren't just minor transgressions. They were the kind of secrets powerful enough to redefine public perception, to make Thomas Miller fall from grace, not in a stormy spectacle, but through a series of well-placed, inescapable truths. There were fake invoices, side deals with market rivals, funds siphoned into offshore accounts under shells registered in barely pronounceable Caribbean locales. She cataloged each in her notebook, cross-referencing them with project timelines, staff emails, and phone records she'd quietly captured off Thomas's office laptop during his gym visits. Every piece was corroborated, no room for speculation. But secrets don't upend lives just by existing. They must be unlocked, revealed, and amplified. Susan picked her first confidant with surgical precision, Lisa Hammond, the sharp-witted vice president who'd grown wary of Thomas's expanding secrecy. Over coffee, Susan asked seemingly innocent questions about an ad campaign that never materialized and legislative contributions that didn't add up. She planted a few seeds, then left Lisa's sharp mind to do the watering. Lisa's professional curiosity turned quickly into suspicion. Soon, she was the one sharing articles about executives ousted for financial misdeeds, hinting she knew more than she let on. Next came the late-night emails, anonymous, untraceable, sent from public library systems 2 towns over. Short, fact-packed, never speculative. Check the April accounts payable, compare with January vendor list. Or, board meeting minutes, cross out who wasn't in the room when grant allocations shifted. Each missive was designed to gnaw at the boundaries of comfort, turning at least 2 board members into wary adversaries of Thomas. Almost overnight, Susan never gloated. She simply watched as the questions rippled outward, always ready with another breadcrumb the moment suspicion began to die down. Of course, the stakes were higher with the Miller family's closest friends, those whose loyalty had shielded Thomas for years. For them, Susan's strategy was gentler. Drop quiet confessions about the overwhelm and pressure she'd felt at home. Reveal her nervousness over some of Thomas's unusually stressed behavior. And trade whispered worries at dinner parties. With each gentle nudge, she was both trustworthy friend and concerned wife, never the vengeful architect behind the scenes. But guilt and fear were powerful motivators for Thomas, too. As rumors swelled, his behavior changed. He began double-checking his phone logs, showing up at meetings with nervous energy, snapping at colleagues over minor errors. When their son's school called about a missed tuition payment, Thomas's carefully controlled world threatened to spiral. He berated the accountant behind closed doors, while Susan quietly offered tissues to the shell-shocked employee, sowing just enough sympathy to ensure whispers of discontent, not outright rebellion. Susan's next move involved the local press. She'd spent years smiling at community events, blending into backgrounds. But now, she used her knowledge of the town's social web as leverage. She secretly reached out to Natalie Brooks, an investigative journalist with a knack for following money trails. The contact was anonymous, of course. Susan used a friend's name to set up meetings in busy, neutral spaces, passing along photocopied documents and cryptic tips. Natalie, seasoned and persistent, caught the scent immediately. Soon, public records were being unearthed, shell companies identified, and Thomas's late-night business meetings became the subject of small-town speculation. Yet Susan knew that pulling one thread could not unravel Thomas's whole tapestry. It was the combination of persistent doubt, the steady drip of truth, and the slow social unraveling that made the difference. She orchestrated professional setbacks. Clients who were once loyal began requesting audits. Partners started quietly freezing accounts. And whispers about Thomas's ethics reached the very charity board that once celebrated his generosity. All the while, Susan moved with an almost meditative calm. Her life at home, a study in contrast. Routine school runs, birthday cakes, book club meetings with the same women who would soon gossip about her downfall. The true brilliance in Susan's method was her understanding of timing and subtlety. She purposely never pushed too hard, never a direct accusation, never a threat. Instead, she let the facts speak for themselves, allowing others to draw their own conclusions. When Thomas tried to patch things up or control the narrative, Susan would be just a step ahead. A casual comment with a neighbor about new information in the news, a pointed question at the parent-teacher meeting about corporate sponsors. The walls of Thomas's social stature closed in ever tighter. Each revelation, like a stone sinking deeper into the collective consciousness of the community. On especially hard nights, Susan wrestled with guilt and doubt. What if she was becoming the kind of person she never wanted to be? But she reminded herself that the cost of ignoring the truth was far greater, that every unveiled secret was not just about retribution, but about reclaiming honesty for herself and her children. She wasn't just building a case against Thomas. She was constructing a future that would be free of manipulation and fear. The unraveling reached its crescendo during a particularly tense board meeting, where, for the first time, Thomas was confronted with direct questions he couldn't answer. The room grew oppressively silent as facts were presented. Precise dates, unexplained transactions, statements from former employees. Susan had taken care that not a single piece of information could be traced back to her. And yet, she was everywhere in that room, the invisible hand guiding doubt into certainty. Outside corporate walls, the dominoes began to fall as well. A major client delayed payments, citing unforeseen inconsistencies. Local news hinted at a coming expose, and Thomas's morning runs became increasingly frantic. People began to look at Susan with new eyes, not as the silent housewife, but as someone braver, perhaps even dangerous in her quiet resilience. The final act of revelation came not with shouts, but with the collective hush that descends just before the truth topples denials. Thomas's best friend called to ask where things had gone wrong. Acquaintances who'd once vied for the miller's attention began to distance themselves. Business partners scheduled emergency reviews. At home, their children sensed the shift. Bedtime stories tinged with uncertainty, the house itself echoing with the tension of impending change. Susan's journey through the labyrinth of secrets wasn't only about exposing a man. It was about peeling away the layers, even those she wore herself, and discovering that the path to freedom was paved not by the demolition of another's life, but by the honest, painstaking release of everything false and rotten within her own. In the hush before the storm, Susan finally understood. The true power of secrets was not in their darkness, but in the courage it took to bring them into the light. Emerging in the public eye, the moment the story broke felt surreal, like the world had shifted on its axis, snapping into a reality that had always lingered just beyond the gilded edges of their lives. For years, Susan had been a background figure, the quiet spouse whose Presence was
I admit
known,
I knew the
but
victim,
rarely
but I
acknowledged.
had no reason
Her
to harm them.
contributions to the family's
I've been
image
completely honest with
reduced
you.
to well-choreographed
Look
smiles
closely, Michael.
and the occasional
When was
speech
the
at
last time
charity
you saw her
galas.
genuinely
In those
smile
first
like that?
headlines, however, her name wasn't mentioned. The focus was Thomas, businessman, philanthropist, community pillar, now accused of the very malfeasance Susan had so methodically unearthed. Susan woke before dawn, the day news vans rumbled into the neighborhood. The engine hum and the sharp click of heels on pavement outside were unfamiliar invasions on her tranquility. She watched through the kitchen window,
After all
arms
this time,
wrapped tight around herself, coffee growing cold between her hands. Even in the earliest light, reporters huddled in small knots, hands gripping microphones, eyes scanning for any sign of the Miller family. Susan let the scene unfold with a kind of somber curiosity, almost an anthropologist dissecting a cultural event decades in the making. For the world, this was an exposé. For Susan, it was an unraveling that had begun inside her own home. The public spectacle was simply the externalization of a private grief she'd borne for too long. The day's anxieties stretched endlessly. Her phone vibrated with calls from friends feigning concern, acquaintances sniffing around for gossip, and relatives whose voices flickered between sympathy and suspicion. She politely declined every request for comment. Silence, she believed, was her first act of agency. But silence, in crisis, is rarely interpreted as strength. Rumors filled the void. Some said Susan must have known about Thomas's duplicity all along. Others imagined her as a victim, blindsided and adrift. Still others, more cynical, speculated whether she herself had been the source of the leaks fueling the investigation. Watching social media swarm with speculation about her motives, Susan felt both exposed and oddly liberated. These people, so quick to judge, had never truly seen her. Their opinions mattered less than they ever had. With every news alert and every whispered conversation at the grocery store, Susan confronted a new reality. She could let herself be defined by Thomas's scandal, by what had been done to her, or she could step forward and show the world another truth, bolder and more honest. The first step was the hardest. The children needed answers. Their confusion was a storm she couldn't shield them from any longer. She gathered them late one evening, voices trembling but steady, and told a story not of criminal wrongdoing, but of personal integrity. Sometimes people we love make choices that hurt others. What matters most is whether we choose to live a life we're proud of, even when it's hard. The conversation cracked something inside her, a wall built of decades-old caution and self-doubt. For the first time, Susan didn't feel like she was performing. She was simply speaking her truth. Afterward, she pulled out a notebook and started drafting a statement, one that would be hers alone, not shaped by Thomas or his legal team, but informed by years of observation, disappointment, and, finally, quiet resolve. She chose to release her statement publicly a few mornings after the news frenzy began. The sky was ash gray and heavy. The garden, usually so vibrant, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of so much scrutiny. Seated behind her kitchen table, an old laptop propped open, Susan recorded a video. She wore no makeup, dressed plainly, her hair pulled back in a way that exposed the lines etched by years of worry and work. The world expected a demonstration of guilt or excuse. They got something else entirely. Susan's hands never trembled. Her eyes met the camera with the quiet assurance of someone who has already survived the worst. She spoke about truth. I have learned that silence in the face of harm only breeds more harm. For years, I thought protecting my family meant hiding the cracks, patching the holes, turning my face away from hard questions. But real strength isn't silent. Real strength is honest. And honest living sometimes means standing alone. She did not throw Thomas under the bus, nor did she defend him. She named the shame and the heartbreak, but rejected the shame that belonged to his actions. She told the community she was proud, above all, to have found the courage to step out of secrecy. And she asked for privacy and understanding for her children. Then simply, the camera faded to black. The video went viral, shared not just by the local outlets feasting on Thomas's downfall, but by people far outside their social sphere. People hungry for something genuine in an age of spin and spectacle. In her inbox, Susan found hundreds of responses, some supportive, some suspicious, most expressing relief at her candor. Overnight, she watched a new narrative begin to root, a story not of complicity or naive ignorance, but of a woman clearing her own path through a storm she hadn't chosen. With the public eye upon her, Susan realized there would be no easy retreat. Her very presence, at school events, in the grocery store, running in the early morning, to some symbolized resilience, to others, silent judgment. There were stares and whispers, moments when people offered support, moments when they averted their eyes. At a parent-teacher conference, a fellow mother reached out gently, confiding, "Thank you for showing all of us how to face hard truths with grace." It wasn't vindication, not exactly, but it felt like an opening, a way to be seen, finally, as herself. Thomas, meanwhile, retreated further into isolation. His phone calls grew brisk and transactional. Invitations to public events dried up. In the Miller home, it was Susan's voice that steadied the children. Susan's calm that ensured the routine of daily life continued. Breakfast made, dogs walked, homework checked, even laughter over burnt cookies or cartoons on a Saturday morning. She grieved for what was lost, for the life she thought she'd built. But beneath the ache was a strange, persistent hope, a sense that something new was being born in the fires of this very public reckoning. Her legal process was complex, and Susan quickly learned the difference between private heartbreak and public consequence. She fielded calls from lawyers, reporters, advocacy groups. She found herself called to account not only for Thomas's decisions, but for decades of silent endurance. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" a journalist asked during a brief phone interview. Susan answered, honestly, "Because I thought love meant loyalty at all costs. Now I know love sometimes means standing for what's right, even if you stand alone." Susan made a point not to hide from the world. She resumed her volunteer work at the community garden, attended PTA meetings, and kept her head high, even when whispers followed her through crowded hallways. She drafted articles advocating for financial transparency in nonprofit organizations, quietly mentoring other women who suspected wrongdoing in their own families or companies. These weren't grand gestures. They were daily choices, threading a new kind of courage into the tapestry of her life. In the months that followed, the Miller story was overtaken by fresher scandals and newer controversies. But Susan's reputation did not disappear into obscurity. Without intending to, she'd become a symbol, imperfect, sometimes misunderstood, but undeniably resilient. Her children grew bolder, asking harder questions, trusting their mother's answers, even when they were messy or incomplete. And Susan herself felt the weight of exposure lessen, replaced not by the easy comfort of vindication, but by something truer. The knowledge that she could survive the world's gaze and still choose each day to be honest and kind. The emergence was not without cost. Susan lost friends she'd once counted as sisters. She was forced to reckon with flaws, not only in Thomas, but in her own patterns of silence and self-erasure. But she also found allies and new callings, colleagues who admired her candor, strangers who saw themselves in her story, even distant relatives who confided long-held secrets of their own, seeking the permission to break their own silence. There were difficult nights when fear crept in, when the threat of lawsuits and social exile felt overwhelming. But Susan carried with her a hard-won understanding that she was more than the worst thing that had happened to her, more than the wife of a disgraced man, more than the subject of tabloid speculation. She was a woman who had looked directly at ugliness and chosen, over and over, not to be defined by it. One gray morning, months after the story first broke, Susan stood outside her home as the last of the news crews packed up their equipment. The neighborhood was returning to normal. Gardens tended, cars rolling past, the hum of every day, routine reclaiming space from the scandal. A neighbor walked by, her young daughter in tow, and offered a small smile. The gesture was simple, but it marked an ending and a beginning all at once. Susan breathed deep, feeling the air on her face, the subtle tremor of anticipation in her ribs. She knew the world would not grant her an easy chapter after this. But she was no longer afraid of being seen. She was no longer living for other people's expectations. The person she saw in the window's reflection each morning was someone she could finally respect, someone who carried truth not as a weapon, but as a torch. Her journey into the public eye had been one of risk and loss, but also of reclamation. The world had tried to cast her as a victim, a villain, a silent accomplice. Yet in choosing to emerge, she had shaped herself as something far more complex, a survivor, a truth-teller, and a mother forging a new kind of legacy. The journey to personal liberation, freedom for me, was never a singular, explosive moment. It unfolded slowly in the hushed hours after the truth had finally been freed. The days that followed the public storm felt empty at first, as if my life had been gutted and scrubbed raw, every facade and denial ripped away. I walked through my home one morning, trailing my fingers along the backs of chairs, dust motes swirling in the golden sunlight. The silence was unfamiliar, heavier somehow, not with secrets, but with possibilities. Liberation, I was beginning to learn, isn't absence. It's the restoration of self after years of obscurity. I recognized that I had let myself disappear in service of a false ideal for too long. The act of finally naming my suffering and shining light on the deceptions of my past became a turning point, a rebirth into a version of myself I barely remembered. I found a peculiar quiet inside, a steadiness that had nothing to do with the world's judgment or expectations. This was my starting line. Each day brought small, deliberate choices. I kept my promise to the children and made breakfast every morning, determination replacing the numbness that once filled my routine. We navigated a new normal together, one where their questions, even the difficult ones, were answered honestly. When my youngest asked if everything would be okay, I didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, I said, "We're going to find our own way. It might not look like it did before, but that doesn't mean it can't be beautiful." At first, the outside world felt hostile. There were lingering looks at the grocery store, whispers at school functions, a handful of friends who drifted away, uncertain how to relate to my new openness. Still, something in me resisted the urge to shrink. I volunteered at community events, responded to messages from women who had seen my story
Yeah,
in the
definitely
news
forced entry.
and found
Looks like a
unexpected
standard
kinship
pry job.
in those braving their own storms. Liberation began to mean community, not seeking validation, but offering and receiving genuine support without judgment.
Can you confirm the
The
time you
hardest
arrived
part
at the scene, Mr.
was letting
Johnson? We
go
need to
of the
establish a
anger
timeline.
that had fueled me
I don't
through the
remember. It was
hardest
so
chapters.
fast.
For so
Where
long,
were you at 10 p.m.
vengeance
last night?
and vindication had seemed
know you were
like
there.
twin
I
beacons,
swear I don't know
necessary
anything about it.
perhaps to survive and force a reckoning. But with each passing week, the desire for revenge dulled and was replaced by a longing for peace. I began therapy, confronting not just the trauma inflicted by Thomas's deceptions, but also the ways I had betrayed myself, staying silent, ignoring warning signs, convincing myself that endurance was the same as strength. Real liberation meant forgiving myself for those choices and for the time lost to self-neglect.
This links him to the
My
warehouse.
relationship to the truth evolved
How
too.
does the senator fit
I no
in?
longer felt the need to recount every detail to everyone. Honesty became quieter, rooted less in confession and more in clarity. In conversations with my children, I modeled this subtlety, acknowledging the past without allowing it to define us, ensuring that our future would be built on something far sturdier than secrets or the brittle pride of perfection. I carved out new spaces for myself. Afternoons spent in the community garden, evenings at a pottery wheel, reconnecting with hobbies abandoned in the chaos of preservation. These modest joys became proof that healing wasn't always grand or visible, but found in repetition and growth, in the messy beauty of forming something new with my own hands. The garden, especially, mirrored my own journey, pulling weeds, planting seeds, trusting that in time, the wounds in the earth and in myself would close, giving way to something vibrant and alive. With time, my perspective on the past softened. Where once I could only see loss and betrayal, I started to glimpse the shadows of resilience and wisdom. I realized that strength is found not in denying vulnerability, but in embracing it. I didn't need to be unbreakable for my children. I needed to be present and real, willing
Thank
to
you so much
apologize,
for coming out
to
today.
laugh,
I really hope
to
you
cry,
enjoy the book.
to begin again. Support came from unexpected places. A former adversary who sent a letter of empathy, a quiet neighbor who dropped off homemade bread with a note. You're stronger than you know. I learned to allow kindness in, to let go of the shame that had kept me in hiding, and to accept that the road ahead didn't demand unflagging optimism, only steady, honest progress. There were relapses into fear and doubt, nights when the house felt cavernous and cold, but more often there were moments of connection, of laughter returning around the dinner table, of a fragile but growing hope. My concept of freedom transformed. No longer was it defined by what I had left behind, but by what I was creating. A family rebuilt on trust, friendships that encouraged vulnerability, and a home where the truth was always welcome. I realized that surviving the storm had given me the tools to help others weather their own. I began speaking at local support groups, not as the woman whose husband had been exposed, but as someone who had reclaimed her life, bit by bit, choice by choice. Looking back, the journey to personal liberation was never linear or easy. Liberation was sometimes quiet and sometimes loud, a word of comfort, a fight with my inner critic, a sunrise that reminded me of how much lay ahead. If there was one lesson I carried forward, it was this: the real freedom comes in accepting and loving every flawed, frightened, fiercely persistent part of who I am. I no longer see myself as the victim of someone else's story, but as the author of my own. Standing here, firmly rooted in the present, I know that every step I take is mine, and that the woman I see in the mirror is finally, confidently, her own. This is what liberation truly means: the permission to rebuild, to hope, and to flourish, no longer hidden behind anyone else's idea of perfection.